Given his bravery, skill, and track record, Ras Alula certainly places among Ethiopia's best generals. Of all the battles he led, Dogali may have been his bloody masterpiece. Italian occupation of and encroachment from Massawa quickly became a point of contention with Ras Alula, whose provinces were now directly under Italian threat. As a result, by the time that Ras left for Kufit in 1885, historian Haggai Erlich claims these neighbors were already at a Cold War. By June 24, 1885, the Italians occupied the Ethiopian-controlled settlement of Sahati. Naturally, this wasn't done with Alula's consent, and in spite of Italian efforts to keep this operation secret, he found out. When the Egyptians stationed at Sahati left in early August, Alula asked the Italians to leave in kind. They didn't, and instead notified Alula of their intent to build houses there for protection from the oncoming seasonal rains. Now, if the Italians were allowed to build houses, it would indirectly serve as an Ethiopian sanctioning of their presence. Emperor Yohannes seems to have figured as much. A letter from him ordered Alula to attack the Italians if they built their houses. The Italians backed off. Neither side could keep peace with this kind of diplomacy, so in early September, when the Italians sent a letter seeking a resolutionary treaty with the emperor, Alula was more than pleased. He forwarded notice of this to Yohannes before leaving to fight the Ansars at Kufit. By the time Alula returned from his Kufit campaign, a major Wallo Oromo uprising forced Yohannes, some of his loyal lords, and Negus Menelik to divert their contemporary goals to subdue the revolt. In his absence, Yohannes put Alula in charge of the northern part of the empire, with orders not to attack the Italians. Given Alula's situation, I can't imagine he wanted to anyway. His noble guard was still recovering from Kufit, Yohannes' imperial army was busy farther south, and the Italians seemed to have been opening to peaceful relations. Alula's positive attitude towards, quote, peaceful relations was quickly dispelled. Since Kufit neutralized the Mahdists on the northern front, previously Mahdist-aligned clans looked towards the Italians for companionship. Italy, eager to expand influence, was friendly towards these friends of Ethiopian enemies. Alula, in an attempt to play Italy's game of befriending the enemy's enemy, tried for a French alliance. He sought to give them control of the port of Zela, the plan being that, in giving the French control of it, Alula would counteract Italian influence, and instead of having to rely on unreliable and frankly unfriendly Italy, guarantee himself trade goods, especially weapons, through the French. Alula's plan ultimately failed. French negotiations were slow and unreliable, and Italy already unofficially controlled the port and General Bay of Zela anyway. By May of 1886, Emperor Yohannes involved himself directly into Italo-Ethiopian diplomacy, deciding to look to the British for support, as they had been during Egyptian negotiations. The British, in turn, told Yohannes not to worry too much with Italy. Alula didn't agree with this, and apparently fell into a temporary disgrace with Yohannes after a spat on the issue. Later on, Yohannes ordered Alula to deal with some gathering pro-Mahdist factions in the Kufit and Bogos areas, and after successfully returning, to capture Casala, likely to preemptively counteract growing Mahdist influence on Ethiopia's western frontiers. Yohannes gave Alula 10,000 troops for this expedition. Now, despite being a theoretically sound idea, the Casala campaign was probably a strategic blunder. In fact, Elrich speculates Alula knew. Elrich writes that Alula probably believed that the 10,000 men would have been far more useful if he, quote, led them down to the coast, end quote, to deal with Italy. But in spite of knowing this, Alula, seeking to regain imperial favor, marched to Casala anyway. By December, Alula met with some of Yohannes' generals at Kufit, sent spies to Casala, devastatingly plundered the locals, and then left for Adwa, not once attacking Casala. Why this happened is unclear. Some believe it was Yohannes' order to return home, others that Alula decided to create a buffer by pillaging and ravaging the locals, and others still that Alula, finding Casala prepared for an attack, thanks to his earlier spies, decided it simply wasn't worth attacking, But regardless, in withdrawing to Adwa, Alula had failed his mission. This probably would have put Taras into further disgrace with the emperor had it not been for a new development. By November 1886, Italy officially occupied Zella, and then Wea. While Ethiopian control over the former was contested, Wea, being clearly Ethiopian-held land, proved Alula's stance that, contrary to British letters, the Italians were still a major threat seeking to invade Ethiopian-controlled territory. Therefore, when Alula went to the imperial palace at Mekelle, Johannes put him in charge of Italian policy. Alula quickly took up an aggressive stance and captured some Italian engineers. He then tried to persuade the Italians to leave Sahati multiple times, but they refused, and the situation slowly escalated, until on January 23rd, Alula notified Johannes that he was going to attack Sahati. What happened next would become subject for Italian myth-making for decades. On the 25th of January, the fort of Sahati, manned by 167 Italians and 1,000 native allies, was assaulted by a force of some 20 to 25,000 soldiers under Ras Alula. Hundreds of Ras Alula's men died, at the cost of 4 Italian injuries. That said, Alula's assault wasn't a complete loss. Sahati troops, now low on supplies due to Ethiopian assault, requested assistance. On the 26th of January, Italian Lieutenant Colonel Christophorus, with 500 Italians, 2 machine guns, and about 50 native irregulars, was sent to relieve Sahati. Alula, hearing of this, resolved to attack and defeat this force before they could reinforce the settlement and entrench themselves. Alula spread the 7,000 to 10,000 men who stayed with him along the scrubby hills lining the Italian route. 5,000 of these men were concealed behind the route's scrubby hill vegetation. The remainder were lined along either side of the Italian path. They waited for an ambush. When the Italian columns finally came into range, Alula's men rained down gunfire, and all that could be seen was smoke. The front of the Italian army was annihilated, but Christophorus, at the rear of the army, continued to march forward. When the lieutenant colonel finally realized the severity of his situation, it was too late to escape. He tried to retreat to a nearby hill where he could mount proper defense, but it was too small for Christophorus to properly deploy on. The force was quickly surrounded, and the Italian machine guns eventually either jammed or ran out of ammo. The Ethiopians, drawing their swords and brandishing their spears, closed in for hand-to-hand combat. The Italian force was destroyed that day. Of the approximately 550 Italians and natives deployed, 470, including 23 officers, were killed. Those who survived feigned death. Alula's casualties are unknown, and while one source gives a figure of 1,000 dead, and many would have surely died charging Christophorus' machine guns, I won't take a stance on this. Despite victory, expectations, and pressure from his soldiers, Alula did not push to Massawa. Why this is unknown. Was it because of heavy Ethiopian losses, or because he didn't think he could win such a campaign, or as many other historians believe, because his campaign was unsanctioned by the emperor to begin with? One account goes that later on, while holding a tribunal, Alula got a stern letter from Johannes for fighting the Italians at Dogali, and allegedly went home without eating. Dogali, in the grand scheme of things, wasn't a big battle, having only from 7,500 to 10,500 participants, and resulting in maybe 1,470 casualties, and not even involving the capture of a major fort or city. In only a few months, the Italians who had retreated from Sahati would reoccupy the settlement, reversing the only immediate ramification of the battle. The importance of this battle was more so in the role that it had in diplomacy. Dogali was the first instance of a true Italo-Ethiopian conflict between a major Ethiopian noble and an Italian army. Italy was eager to manipulate it for political gain. Ethiopia was made the aggressor, and a perceived need to defend a colony helped push the government to take more military stances in what would become Italian Eritrea. Forts were built along the border, and by the end of March 1888, 16,000 Italian soldiers and 2,000 native allies occupied the colony. By late 1888 to 1889, official Askari units were formed. The Italians blockaded trade with Alula, Yohannes, and their allies, and further pursued agreements and alliances with the Shawan king Menelik. Alula lost much of the trade that economically drove his capital. Forget that Alula felt that he was defending himself from foreign encroachment. His assault and tactic of ambush were strewn as particularly dishonorable among Europeans. Potential allies turned their backs from the Ras Alula. The French, who were still considering the Zela deal, now permanently stopped negotiations. The British sent a young diplomat, Gerald Portal, to try to persuade the Emperor Yohannes to apologize to Italy and to get Alula removed from his governorship of the Mereberlas province. Regardless, when Portal met with Alula in November of 1886, he got nothing, and when he later met with Yohannes, who had marched up to Lake Asagi with an army, he also saw no success. By the end of the year, no peace treaty came up between Yohannes and the Italians, and Alula still maintained an albeit weakened base of power in the Mereberlas. Instead of a peaceful resolution, full-scale war became even harder to avoid. Yohannes, seeing this all unfold, was now left with few options. Leaving the untrustworthy Negus of Shawa in control of the Wallo and Bagumudar provinces, he mobilized his soldiers for a war that he would never see.